Hi, class. We are back with part 2 of motor speech disorders. We were talking about motor learning and how that happens. And we said very simply that it happens by practice. Well, what does that practice do for us? The theory behind what that practice does for us is called the schema theory. The schema theory contends that individuals develop schemas or memory representations of the relationships between all of these sources of information that they're getting from this motor movement. The schemas hold in memory these motor movement and coordination patterns that are required for a specific outcome. The more experience they have with successful outcome, the stronger the schema becomes. So, in other words, I try a movement, I get a really successful outcome. I do it again the same way, successful outcome. I do it this way. Oh, that one didn't work right. I'm going to abandon it and go back to this first one over and over and over again with a successful outcome. And all of a sudden, it becomes patterned movement. So it's a schema that we can pull on from memory to replicate movement. Someone with a motor speech disorder, the schemas may be unstable, or they've been damaged or learned wrong patterns somehow. So therefore the outcome of their speech attempts will be reduced in intelligibility because of imprecise speech. Now, we're going to talk more later about the difference between phonological disorders and motor speech disorders because we've used that unintelligible descriptor for both, but it is different across those disorders, and we'll get to it in a little bit. So, this is why, in talking about motor speech disorders, we're not just talking about children, although I'm going to talk about children here again for quite a little bit, but just to throw this in here for you. Impairment of neuromuscular function. So, impairment of function is going to interfere with potentially an already intact schema. So, if we think of an adult who has intact schemas and has been having precise speech for their lifetime, and now some impairment comes in to that neuromuscular function and impacts their ability to draw on and reproduce those schemas, we end up with a motor speech disorder. Now, obviously, that can happen in a child too. We could be talking about a 10-year-old who has pretty intact schemas that then are impacted by some event. But I just wanted to throw that in there so you understand that we're not just talking about children, even though right now we're going to go back to children because I'm going to do another spotlight on literacy. I think this is, they're no longer in your book, but again, I think this is an important consideration when we're talking about motor speech disorders because it can help us if we're practitioners in schools. So, as long as a child can perceive the relevant distinctions in another person's speech, okay, so let's say that other person is teacher. The child can perceive the distinctions in that teacher's speech, even though they may not be able to produce it in their own. If they can perceive that, they should be able to learn the association between this written letter and the sound that it makes, okay? They can perceive it. They can perceive it in another person's speech. They can learn it and hold on to it. If that is the case, they should be able to learn that sound symbol correspondence that they need to learn to read. So, our kids with only motor speech disorders, their problem is not perception of speech sounds. It's that planning and execution. So they should be able to learn to read easier than the child with the phonological disorder whose issue is the perception of speech sounds. In the classroom, that will have a bigger impact on sound symbol correspondence and then learning to read. So that's my spotlight on literacy. Prevalence and incidence for motor speech disorders. So again, here we're only going to be talking about children at this point. reliable estimates are hard to come by because we know about 4% of children across let's say preschool to through grade school, through elementary school, 4% average. It's higher the younger they are, and then evens out as they get older. So an average of 4% across those ages present with some speech impairment. But nulling out which of those are motor impairments and which are phonological impairments is where the difficulty comes. There sometimes it's very clear cut, but there are other times that it's not. So coming up with numbers for prevalence and incidence is difficult. So how do we classify motor speech disorders? There are a number of different classification systems, but we're going to talk about the broadest one first, and that's just, are they acquired or are they developmental? So anytime that we're talking about something that's acquired, it means that there is damage to a previously intact system. So in this case, we're talking about the nervous system. Damage to a previously intact system is an acquired disorder. And I'm stumbling over this because I'm trying not to use other words that are going to confuse you. So an acquired disorder, the most common cause, especially in adults, is cerebrovascular accident, CVA, the acronym CVA. The common name, stroke, because, we like to give everything 5 different names. A stroke, cerebrovascular accident, is an injury to a previously intact neurological system, right? Nervous system. But there are other reasons that we say someone has acquired a disorder. It can be a degenerative disease, so something like Parkinson's or ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. The common name for that is Lou Gehrig's disease, but I understand people of your generation many of you don't even know who Lou Gehrig is. So we're going to call it ALS, but it is a degenerative disease of the nervous system that will result in motor speech disorders. Brain tumors, traumatic brain injury, all of these things can result in motor speech disorders. So those are acquired disorders. Or they can be developmental. So developmental is a result of abnormal development of the nervous system from damage to that nervous system very early in its development. So normally we use the term developmental to say it's present at the time of birth. But it gets a little fuzzy here okay, let me back up. Things like a child can present at the time of birth with congenital issues, things like Down syndrome, Fragile X. Those are genetic chromosomal issues that are present right at the time of birth, right? But children can have, or infants, I'm going to stop saying children, infants can have damage to that developing nervous system at the time of birth or shortly thereafter that result, for example, in cerebral palsy. Cerebral palsy is going to result in a very specific type of motor speech disorder we'll get to in a minute. Children not long after birth, so within the first few weeks of life, maybe up to a month or so of life, can have damage to the developing nervous system caused by traumatic brain injury, by tumors, by strokes. We're going to call all of that developmental because the child has not had the infant has not had the opportunity to have the typical course of development in early infancy of that nervous system. The nervous system continues to develop well through childhood, but that significant development during infancy was taken away because of some incident. We're going to call that developmental, even though you can see the overlap there between developmental and acquired. The term manifestation, we're going to use now moving forward through the rest of our semester. So it's the medical or the diagnostic term that basically just means, how does this disorder present itself? What are the signs and symptoms of disorder? What does it look like? What is the manifestation of motor speech disorder? Well, it's a little different depending on where the breakdown is. So if there's these, by the way, this is another classification system. We're classifying it now by manifestation. So is the breakdown at the level of execution? So for example, a disruption in muscle physiology that's going to result in things like involuntary tremors of the muscles, reduction in range of movement of the muscles. This is going to result in inconsistencies in movement of the muscles. This is all at the level of execution, the muscles actually making the movement they need. Now, this is not the child with a lisp. If I have a child with a lisp and I ask them to do motor movement for me, I can get them to do all the motor movement I ask them to do. That's a different issue. That's more at the issue of that phonological level, right? This is execution. This child now or adult cannot move the muscles the way they need to be moved in a consistent manner for what we're asking them to do. Breakdown at the level of execution. A breakdown at the planning and programming level. Oh, by the way, level of execution is also not things like cleft palate. That's where there is actual damage to the anatomical structure right here in the mouth. Okay, that is not a neurological issue at the level of execution. Okay, hope you're understanding that. Make me question that you ask me later if that's not understandable. A breakdown at the planning and programming level. Remember, I told you now we're always talking about planning and programming together. Breakdown at that level. The muscle physiology and the movement ability is intact. This is a person who can move those muscles the way they're supposed to be moved. They just cannot tell them to move when they want them to. It's inconsistent. The ability to plan and program that movement is inconsistent. There's disruption in coordination of muscle movement. I know this looks like big overlapping gray areas. We're going to come back to this idea. And then we can also classify motor speech disorders based on severity. And again, we use the same scale that we've talked about previously: mild, moderate, profound, or mild, moderate, severe to profound. But this classification of severity includes information about not just the physical manifestation, so not just how many sounds per 100 are impacted, but also about how it impacts this person's life. So how well they can participate in the activities of daily living that are important to them. So for that, we're going to have a little conversation about the World Health Organization, something that's been in the news a lot for the last 6 or 7 months. Now, it's not going to be a political conversation. Don't worry. It's not even going to be a medical conversation in terms of our current pandemic, because it has nothing to do with motor speech disorders, but it's just been in the news a lot lately. The World Health Organization does a lot of other things besides what you've heard about in the news lately. And one of the things it does is it gives us classification systems for classifying medical conditions or developmental conditions. And it gives us classification systems for ranking severity. So that's what we're going to talk about. These four, lost my spot here on my notes. These four aspects of a disorder that help us with describing it, first of all, and then giving us some conversation about severity. Trying to look at my time here. Okay. So the first is, let me name the four and then we'll go back through them. The first is body structure. The second is body function. The third is activity and participation. And the fourth is contextual factors. So we're describing now a disorder and its impact. So body structure. What are the underlying anatomical aspects of a condition that are involved and therefore impede performance? So when we're talking about motor speech disorder, the anatomical structures, the anatomical aspects are the central and peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system, where we're planning and programming, and the peripheral nervous system, where we're executing movement. Okay. The second is body function. These are the physiological functions, in some cases psychological functions, but in our case physiological, the physiological functions that are disrupted by this disorder. So what is disrupted in a motor speech disorder? Well, it's impaired function of the ability to plan, program, and execute speech. That's the disrupted function, right? Then we get on to activity and participation. And this is where we start more talking about also how we rank severity. So activity and participation is how we can now describe the limitations that this affected function has on a person's quality of life, on their performance, and how that impacts their quality of life. The important distinction here is how they perceive that it's impacting their quality of life, their definition of how it's impacting their quality of life. And we're going to come back to that with an example in a minute. And then the fourth is contextual factors. These are factors that are really specific to an individual, so personal factors, things like attitudes and values, or environmental factors like social support systems, what resources are available to this person, coping strategies, sometimes legal and environmental things, cultural beliefs, social cultural beliefs. So these are all the context that this disorder is happening in. So I'm going to tell you about two, I'm really going to tell you about one person, but I'll give you another example. One person that I worked with a number of years ago now was a young lady named Autumn. And when I met Autumn, she was about fourth grade age, so 8 or 9 years old. And Autumn had cerebral palsy. If I were going to rank it just based on her function, so the impaired body parts would be her central and peripheral nervous system to a degree, and then the function was how well she was able to make use of the body systems that were impacted to be functional in her life. I would say that Autumn was really pretty mildly impaired. She could walk. She had control of her hands and her arms. Now she walked with the typical gait of someone with cerebral palsy, so it's kind of a wide, awkward, little discoordination in her movement. She had some weakness in her movement, certainly. She had intelligible speech. Now there was noticeable errors in her speech, but it was intelligible. She came to me for assessment at the public school I was working at. She had been receiving full special education services from the time she was 3 years old. Excuse me. But her family, she lived with mom and single mom, and then some other family members. Her family had made the decision when she was about 5 or 6 to pull her out of school and homeschool her. I shouldn't make any statements about that, but that's what they did. And now they brought her back to me for just a speech assessment. And you can do that when you're homeschooled. You can call on the public school for assessment and for therapy in some cases. So she came to me for assessment. I assessed her speech. Again, I'm going to say it was pretty mild. You could understand her. Really, she only had trouble making a couple sounds, and even those didn't really impact intelligibility very much. Here's Autumn's issue. Remember that activity and participation thing, right? Well, it's supposed to be as defined by the person, but now we're talking about a child. In our conversations, my team's conversations with Autumn's family, what we discovered was that they really did not have any anticipation that Autumn would have any level of independence as an adult. They assumed that this disorder was so impacting her that she would have to live with them and or have some supervision her entire life. Now, Autumn did not have any limitations in intelligence. Her intelligence quotient or her IQ was within the average range. It was a lower end of average, but it was within the average range. There was no reason this little girl could not have independence because her function, remember body parts that we're talking about, body anatomy. I lost the word and I don't have it on my screen. Huh. And then body function. Her body function was not that significantly impaired. So we talked with them a whole lot more about, well, tell us about her day. And well, she can use the microwave, she can use the computer, she can use the television, she dresses herself. Again, she can walk, she can make herself understood. There was no reason this little girl could not grow up to be an independent, functioning, contributing member of society. But her family was teaching her or living in a way that was assuming she would not. So we're looking now at ranking severity based on activity and participation and contextual factors also. Their family values, their cultural or social beliefs for her were that she would not be independent. So in Autumn's case, now her disorder is much more severe because of those factors than it would be could those factors be changed, which they could be. Now, we did help this family to make the decision to put her back in public school. So she finished out 4th grade and then she did 5th and 6th grade in public school. Where she was in regular education. She was at a school site that was in our district specific for children with physical disabilities. So she had physical therapy and occupational therapy, and she probably had speech therapy there, even though that was like the least of her areas of need. She got academic support because she was very behind academically because of some of these contextual factors. And last I heard, they had chosen to pull her back out for junior high and homeschool her, which kind of broke my heart. And I've lost track of her since then. She is probably late high school or even an adult at this point. I've lost track of time with her also. But I just wanted you to see how all of those things fall into our ranking of severity of disorder. Now we have a lot more to talk about the specifics of motor speech disorders, but I'm going to stop this video now, so we'll move on to part 3. So make sure you tune in to part 3.